Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy Friday to all. Hopefully, everybody is doing well. Give me a thumbs up. How's my audio? How's my video? How does the screen look? Everything okay? Can you see the PowerPoint? Thumbs up, yay, nay. I'm guessing that's good. Nick, does the PowerPoint look okay to you?
Yep, coming
Okay,
through
perfect. Awesome,
smoothly.
awesome.
Yep.
Well, welcome everybody. We are on our, what is the sixth session now? Compliance Meets AI. Been a great series so far. I'll post some links as I go through so you can see all the recordings. Everything has been recorded and you're being recorded right now. So if you don't want to be recorded, drop off the call. See lots of familiar faces on here today as well. Some new faces too. So welcome to all of you who have not been yet on one of our sessions today. As always, I am Jay Cotton, and I am a principal architect here at Microsoft. I'll be your host again today. We've got a really great couple sessions coming up now. Just to recap really quick, we've been going through Purview, how we can use Purview in all these different ways of guardrails around AI, monitor of AI, all these different sessions. We went everything from DLP, we've talked about information protection, we've talked about insider risk, we talked about the inline network security. That was last week. If you guys didn't catch that one, that was a fantastic session. I'll make sure we have all the recordings for it. So a lot of different things we've talked about today. And now for the next two sessions, we're going to focus on agents. My good friend Nick Vargas-Viga is on the call with us today. He'll introduce himself here shortly. And we're really talking about agent governance. I think, there's probably not a person on this call who has not heard the word agent at least 1,000 times this week alone. More than likely. I know I have. So it's, of course, everybody's hottest topic. And we're going to talk about agent governance. And we're going to start off with the low code, no code agents, or Copilot Studio Lite, or Agent Builder, declarative agents, pick your name. And then next week, we're going to talk about Foundry agents, so agents that are actually published in Azure Foundry, and how we have governance around those. So two fantastic sessions coming up. Definitely tell your peers if they're at all interested, because they will be sessions you do not want to miss. Just to recap for everybody, everybody's microphones are muted, or disabled, sorry, not muted. Please feel free to ask questions all the time in chat. Go ahead and throw them in the chat or throw them in the Q&A. It doesn't matter which one. I'll be monitoring both of those and we'll answer those as we go. If there's something we think we need to take a little more time to talk about, we may just earmark that one from the end and we'll discuss it live on the camera or on the phone, meeting, whatever. And then, of course, everything is going to be recorded. So all these sessions are recorded. Like I said, I'll post the links in there to you so you can back and review it. And then I'll send out a short survey too at the end of this. It'll be 4 or 5 questions at the most. Please take your couple minutes just to fill that out. It helps us, guide this series. So this isn't going to be, again, just a one and done series. This is actually the second series of sessions we've done. We did one before the holidays in 2025. This is the one for this quarter in 2026. And I'll have another one for basically probably April, May timeframe. Right around May is my guess. My wife's birthday, I can work around there. She's a May baby. So we'll have the sessions in May, so that'll be another one. And these surveys help us guide those sessions. So what do you want to hear more about? What do you want to see more of? And then just let us know how we're doing. Our intent is to make these as useful as possible and as educational as possible for everybody on the call. So just help us out, make sure we're doing the right thing. We can do more, we can do less. Of course, our hosts, as always, you got myself, Jay Cotton. We have Ben Perkins and Kevin Wee, both of two of my peers who have been helping me host these sessions moving through. And of course, you're going to see them later on follow-up sessions as we move into the next quarter and the next series. And then again, this is just a recap. That link is how you register for everything. I'll put that in the chat window as well. This is PowerPoint Live, so you can just click on that link if you wish. If you haven't registered for next week's session, please do. That's when we're talking about Copilot Studio AI Foundry. So another great agent session. I'm really excited to see these, and I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to learn from Nick. Nick is a subject matter expert in this area. He's one of the best that I know. Actually, probably is the best that I know when it comes to agents. Nick and I have worked together for a really long time. We've been doing the Copilot journey basically side by side since Copilot first released. So I think we're all in for a great session, 2 sessions, honestly. Just a reminder too, we also have this Copilot chat, Coffee and Copilot going on. This is training just around Copilot chat. This is the version of Copilot that everybody has access to. I know most of us here are security or compliance focused, but it's also good to see how people use chat. And this particular training is great for that. They kind of walk through about how we can use it. And it's good for us to understand as security people, how people are using it. What are they using it for? What can they do with it? That way we can kind of look at our policies that we have out there, whether it's a DLP policy, whether it's a communication compliance policy or an insider risk policy, and make sure they're tuned to where we want to be. So if you can join those sessions, please do. I'll drop the registration in the chat as we go as well. It's the same thing. These are webinars as well. They do multiples per day or per week. So if you jump on one, just kind of see how people are using it, I think it'd be a really good idea. I find them very interesting too. I actually attend those sessions and present on some of them too. And this is just a reminder for everybody out there. All the content we've covered, whether it's whether it's governance of agents like we're talking about today, whether it's DSPM for AI, whether it's data loss prevention, any of these pieces are out here. We have what we call onboarding accelerators for these. So we always have this onboarding accelerator. This is something that you can attend from Microsoft. So Microsoft hosted sessions. So somebody like myself or Nick would be your instructor for these. Most of them are hands-on workshops as well. So you can actually sit in front and have a demo environment to work in. So you can design your policies however you want to do it. And then you can take that learning, take it back, put it in your production environment as well. So these are all available via Microsoft. Best way to get that is talk to your Microsoft account manager, whoever that may be. If you don't know who that is, drop me an email and I can help you find them if you have one. Most people do have one in some way, shape, or form. So if you don't know who that is, just drop me an email and I can help you get there and get those running. That all being said, I am now going to pass this over to Nick Villa. Nick, you want to introduce yourself and you have the floor, my friend.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here and happy to have you all here as well. As Jay mentioned, the focus of today's session and spreading into or extending into next week's session is agent governance. We want to give you all as much information as we can in a somewhat limited time frame to help understand what are the major considerations, roles, responsibilities, planning strategies, and best practices around supporting AI transformation specific to the enablement, deployment, development, governance, and securing of agents across the organization. This is a huge area of focus for customers, for employees, for users, for Microsoft, and hopefully a very productive conversation and scope of content that we're going to bring to you all today. I'm just going to go ahead and reinitiate the slides because I did just add one last slide at the last minute. I think this is going to be a helpful way to kick things off here. So ultimately, each of the organizations that you're a part of has made an investment in Copilot as a generative AI tool. And the process of bringing generative AI, of bringing the power of large language models into your business is a multi-stage process, and it does transition through a number of phases. Here on the slide, we talk about the frontier firm approach. This is a concept that Microsoft has brought forward to describe the frontier firm, the frontier organization as a business that is focused, that understands the power that generative AI is going to have in helping your organization achieve its own definition of success and embracing that as a technology solution that we have to invest in and enable our workforce to use and be successful with. This is the concept of the frontier firm, and Microsoft has put together a plethora of resources that help organizations understand what we really mean by this, what that vision looks like, and what the execution of that vision looks like for any organization. The frontier firm approach, this is just one snapshot of a bigger picture of that vision and execution strategy, but I think it does help frame the conversation that we want to have today, which is how we see and realize the introduction and transformation of the introduction of generative AI and the transformation of our business using generative AI across 3 phases. The first phase is hopefully something that everybody here has underway, which is the enablement of your users with Copilot. Copilot being the assistant that's there for every employee to help them work better, to help them work faster, to help them save time, to help them be more productive, to help them do their job more efficiently, more successfully, all that good stuff. Okay, we bring AI-powered assistant to every human, to every employee in our organization, and that speaks to the basic enablement. I shouldn't say basic. None of this is basic. The first step is the enablement of Copilot across the organization. Not a trivial task, something that can take anywhere from months to years to fully complete exhaustively to the point where every single user, every single employee in the organization understands what this tool is, understands how to use it successfully, thoroughly, regularly, to be successful, to improve their own productivity, to make their jobs easier, to make them better at accomplishing their business goals. And that is the first step. And hopefully, all of us here are at least underway on that journey to some degree. But there's more to explore, to pursue. There's more value to be had, because once every employee in the organization has that AI-powered assistant, we have to start thinking about the processes in the business processes that really define and drive success for the organization are the next step to AI transformation. And this is what the value of agents addresses directly. Agents represent the opportunity to say, now we've got an assistant for every employee, and that's going to help them do their jobs more effectively. But in terms of how employees together, there are processes, there are workflows, there are patterns within the business that we need generative AI and AI-powered assistants to be focused on, to be contextualized around, to include configuration and definition and implementation and execution strategy. We need to have the opportunity to harness generative AI, to harness large language models, contextualized around the actual processes, procedures, workflows, and patterns that make our business run, and make these processes available to our users as the next step of agentic transformation, of AI transformation across the organization. And that's where human agent teams, where we have employees and agents working alongside each other together, allows us to realize an incredible new pillar or plateau of value from our investments in Copilot. And finally, we get to that third phase. And at this point, in terms of Microsoft's own implementation of this program, of this realization of the vision of being a frontier firm, we are somewhere internally here at Microsoft between stage 2 or phase 2 and phase 3. Every employee at Microsoft has Copilot. And over the last 16 months, we have seen an incredible investment from our business divisions to create, build, and deploy agents that support us as employees. And we have seen an incredible investment from our organization to empower us as employees to create agents that help ourselves as well. And so we're now at this point internally here at Microsoft where we have this phase 2 vision well underway, human agent teams, and we're starting to realize this phase 3, human-led, agent-operated. We have sales agents that now run completely autonomous, that are led by folks within our customer success division that drive, that oversee the outcomes of these agents. So this, we're going to get to this. Hopefully this is a reasonable starting point for the conversation of why we want to start planning how to govern agents. We are going to focus heavily on governance, and we're going to get into that very, very soon here. But I wanted to set the stage with this perspective on where Microsoft sees the AI transformation journey, where hopefully you all can track your current state and targeted future state in this journey, and understand getting Copilot, getting AI in the hands of every employee is a critical first step. The next step from that is starting to inject and bring generative AI, large language models, and Copilot directly to the processes that power our business. And then that final third step is designing processes that run completely autonomously, that can be directed and managed by humans, but that ultimately run on their own and execute and carry out business functions on their own, leading to the most value that we can realize with the generative AI services that are available to us within the M365 suite, being Copilot and Copilot Studio. Okay, so we have this picture of where Microsoft sees the value and the journey of Copilot within the organization. Copilot for every user, agents for every process, agents running autonomously to make the business processes run smoothly and as effectively as possible. How do we get our hands around the idea of governing all of this? We are proposing a significant proliferation of agents across the business in the second and third stage of this journey. We've talked about a co-pilot for every user. We've talked about an agent for every process. Internally here at Microsoft, that's tens of thousands of AI-powered agents, potentially hundreds of thousands of AI-powered agents at scale. So certainly, the question of governance and management and control and security and IT operations and best practice is critical. And we want to be proactive in this regard. We want to be proactive in thinking through what this is going to look like over the next 6, 12, and 18 months. Because if your users aren't asking for this today, they're going to be asking for it very, very soon. Every single organization that I support has users coming forward with business cases saying, how can I bring AI into this process? I have a process that deals with data, that deals with knowledge, that deals with business content, and AI is going to make this so much easier and more successful and more scalable. It's going to free up time. It's going to allow me to be productive, etc. These folks from the business are going to be coming forward and asking for help to achieve these outcomes using our technology. We have to be ready. We have to be ready with the guardrails, the governance, and the framework for scaling this to every single process in the organization. If you haven't already started to see those requests come to you all, I would imagine it's going to happen very soon. There are a variety of historical precedents for technologies being available in the consumer landscape, driving enterprise transformation. AI is going to be one of those. Okay, users have access to these tools in their own personal lives, and they're going to start connecting the dots and clicking in terms of how powerful these tools are and thinking through that question. What if we could use these tools in our business context? And so we're going to see the consumer landscape drive a lot of user awareness and a lot of interest in and demand for this kind of generative AI transformation. Okay, let's talk about the governance then. Let's get into the actual substance of the conversation here. Ultimately, within M365, within the M365 service, Copilot is the backbone of all of this. And the governance plane that Microsoft provides for you on governing Copilot, we refer to as the Copilot control system. And it spans three major pillars: security and governance, the management controls that you need to tune the product to align with the requirements of the organization, and the measurement and the reporting information that allows you to define the value, to quantify the business impact, and to justify the investments being made. This is the Copilot control system, something that you guys have heard about significantly throughout the entirety of this series. Taking that a step forward, though, in terms of how this applies to agents, Microsoft has put together this three-zone strategy for agent governance and agent control. This is the pattern, this is the methodology that we've used internally here at Microsoft to realize the proliferation of generative AI within M365 at scale. And it spans the individual contributor, the business user, all the way up to the organizational and enterprise level solution. We have three zones here, and we want to think about and classify the development of agents as an activity that will exist across one of these three zones. We want to empower and encourage citizen development. We want to enable the business users that are out there that have the deepest and most profound understanding of the business processes that make the business run. We want to empower those folks to be successful and create these solutions on their own. IT is always going to be the best positioned in terms of the technology requirements and the technology understanding, but the business users are always going to be the best positioned in terms of the context that's needed to harness that technology. And so there needs to be an opportunity and a framework for letting any business user start to undertake the implementation of Copilot within their day-to-day responsibilities. And so a citizen development zone, a zone 1, makes perfect sense. This is where we're going to find the need for very, very well-defined guardrails so that we can say users across the organization are going to be allowed to participate in the tools of zone 1 essentially unmonitored or without any exhaustive monitoring, because we've created a set of guardrails that ensures that it doesn't matter what they build. It doesn't matter what they do within zone 1. We know what the tools are. We know what the data looks like. We know what the security enforcements are that are available, and we have confidence in those. And so from within zone 1, users can essentially do what they need to do. There are going to be some things that we want to keep an eye on, but we don't need to go agent by agent, use case by use case, evaluating what is happening in this particular agent, in this particular pattern. We rely on the high-level walls and structures and controls that bound and contain the functionality of Zone 1 to make this available safely, securely, and scalably. We get into Zone 2 and Zone 3, and the conversation changes a little bit. Here is where we have the greatest opportunity to integrate with the entirety of our data estate and our technology landscape across the organization. We're talking about going outside the M365 service boundary now. We're talking about integrating with anything in your organization that drives the business outcome, any data, any user, any process. And so we can't have quite as rigid guardrails, walls, and boundaries around how these technologies works in Zone 2 and Zone 3. And so we need tremendously more process, and we need more oversight, more approvals, and more controls around what's happening here, how it's happening, and who's participating, and what they're building. Zone 2 and Zone 3 is going to be mostly a focus for next week's conversation. This week, we're going to focus on Zone 1, the Citizen Development Zone. I will say at a high level, in terms of what you need to focus on as an organization, as you start this journey, from my view, the focus should be from Zone 3 down. Because when it comes to such a new technology, we're bringing AI to the business essentially for the first time, at least in this context, at least in the context of agents and AI-powered transformation through agentic processes that model and streamline our business. This is most likely going to be a fairly new experience and transformation. And so we want to drive success and we want to drive impact using high-value, broadly applicable use cases that really prove this is worthwhile. And what you're going to find is that Zone 2 and Zone 3 are going to be best positioned to deliver on those kinds of use cases. Okay, use cases that help facilitate key workloads in HR and IT. Use cases that help facilitate key workload in your core business units. Developed in Zone 2 and Zone 3 are the place to start. And citizen development is absolutely a critical value pillar. But in terms of the place to start, I would suggest we need to get those guardrails up, but the areas that we invest in terms of the development and the focus and the energy to drive adoption and to drive implementation should really begin with Zone 3 and Zone 2 and move into Zone 1 once we establish some maturity and once we define success and value in that initial phase. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to focus mostly on Zone 1 and Zone 2 today. And on the slide, you can see that we include a quick look at what tools are available in each of these zones. Okay, and maybe you all aren't quite as familiar with what these icons mean. So we'll just break this down. Okay, we have the core Copilot service, and we have the SharePoint service. Oops. Okay, and that's what we have in Zone 1, Copilot and SharePoint. Zone 2, we also have Copilot, and we consider Copilot Agent Builder, Copilot Studio Lite as a technology solution available in Zone 2, but we also have Copilot Studio, and that's what this icon represents, and this is really what we're going to be talking about next week, Copilot Studio and Foundry, okay? So there are ultimately 3 technology solutions within the M365 service that need to be categorized across these zones. We have the core Copilot service, which offers Copilot Studio Lite, now known as Agent Builder, and SharePoint, and SharePoint Online, which is a platform for building agents. Within Zone 2, we have the Copilot Studio Lite, now known as Agent Builder, and Copilot Studio Full. And then in Zone 3, we have Copilot Studio, and we have Foundry. Okay, so these are the technology solutions that we are going to need to categorize and set up governance for. And ultimately today, within Zone 1, we're going to focus on SharePoint and Copilot Studio Lite, now known as Agent Builder. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into our demonstrations now, and we're going to essentially have the rest of this conversation focused on a real-time tour of the products and the administrative controls and some documentation that I hope you all will find valuable. So we're talking about the tools available to build Zone 1 agents. In order to really define what those guardrails should be, we need to have at least a fundamental understanding of what the tools allow. My goal today is not to sell you on the value of SharePoint agents. I could spend an hour just talking about the features, the capabilities, and the reasons why this is incredibly useful for our users. When I initially started, when Copilot initially came out, and as Jay mentioned earlier, Jay and I have been supporting customers on Copilot journey from its initial availability as a technology solution in M365. When this first came out, customers badly wanted it fully integrated into SharePoint and available directly in the context of the sites that they work in. That's what SharePoint agents provide. And so a tremendously valuable experience. It came forward in the product eventually relative to that initial availability of Copilot. It is here now, and it is tremendously valuable. And it is an incredible opportunity for users to just build what they need, to use AI in the context of their business data very easily without a lot of significant IT overhead. I've heard from customers that say, I don't want Zone 1 agents. I just want Zone 2 and Zone 3 agents. I want IT to build, manage, and deploy everything that's going to provide AI transformation to the business. And Zone 1 is just too much work to manage, to govern, to maintain, to observe, etc. And I would suggest, without Zone 1, we are missing out on an incredible value opportunity. The amount of quality and value and return on investment that we get by allowing users to leverage generative AI in the context of their own SharePoint sites, their own business data, and the processes that they're facilitating from those sites is not to be denied. If we allow and embrace this technology and give users some basic information about it, I guarantee you will see usage, and as you talk to and get qualitative feedback from your users, you will hear about SharePoint agents as incredibly useful. And if you commit to a Zone 2 or Zone 3 strategy only, you're taking on so much process overhead, because I absolutely agree, Zone 2 and Zone 3 agentic transformation has to be well governed, because those particular verticals and the tools contained within them really open up a toolbox that needs to be well defined and monitored on an agent by agent use case. And so if you go down a path where you're only focused on Zone 2 and Zone 3 and not giving users a Zone 1 pillar or vertical or opportunity, you're taking on a tremendous amount of overhead within your teams to facilitate everything that needs to happen as it relates to AI transformation and the development of agents. Okay, so we need some basic understanding of SharePoint agents in order to really start wrapping our minds around the governance that they require. And so I will say, the agent experience within a SharePoint site is available via an agent menu that's available immediately on the global navigation bar. Okay, the global navigation bar for your SharePoint sites has the agent icon, and from here you can open up the agents pane and start to interact with agents. And from here you can start to create new agents as well. And I just want to walk very quickly through this to underscore what the capabilities are, because fundamentally what you can do with a SharePoint agent is not drastically different from what you can do by just going to Copilot and constructing a very well articulated and nuanced prompt. Okay, you can go to Copilot and say, I have this business process and it has 17 steps, and here are those 17 steps. And I want you to look at all the documents in this SharePoint site, and I want you to look at these 17 steps, and I want you to evaluate this content, this proposal, this contract, this addendum, this agreement, this resume, whatever the case may be. I want you to go to the site, look at my steps, evaluate that document, and show me what step 7 or step 8 should contain. You can go to Copilot and you can put a prompt like that together. And that's ultimately what we have the ability to define within the context of a SharePoint agent. We define our sources. Our sources being content from SharePoint or OneDrive, not going outside of the Microsoft Graph, not going outside of the scope of what that user has access to. And then you can define instructions. And these instructions really represent the implementation of the unique process that needs to happen relating to that business content. And that is essentially the extent of what this functionality is. There is a little bit more polish. Okay, starter prompts, a welcome message, a custom description, an icon, a logo. Okay, we want to make this all look and feel very accessible and approachable. But fundamentally, what we're defining here is a list of knowledge sources across SharePoint and OneDrive that the agent needs to focus on, and an instruction set that defines exactly what steps and process the agent needs to carry out. And so there's not a tremendous amount of functionality here that could not be realized by just going to Copilot chat and creating a prompt that ultimately captures all of that information. The value is in the scalability. The value is in the subject matter experts that know your business, building the agent and making it available to any user across the organization that may not be a subject matter expert, that may not understand everything that would need to go into that very well-defined 17-step prompt to achieve a particular business outcome. Some folks in the business will know what these processes are and will be able to build and define them and share them as an agent with the rest of the business. And there's going to be significant value in this, even if we understand that if every single employee was an expert on every single process, they could probably go to Copilot chat and sort of prompt their way through the same kind of result. So at a high level, that's what we're talking about with SharePoint agents. It is the opportunity to leverage the content within SharePoint, scoped down, specified, and targeted to the information that's particular to a business process, combined with instructions that define clearly everything that needs to be understood about that process so that we can scalably support the use of generative AI in the context of that particular process. For example, I have an agent here that is focused on helping the marketing department support all of the steps needed to create a campaign estimate. And the marketing department within a particular hospital allows any other division or provider or team within the hospital to initiate some kind of marketing campaign. And the marketing department fields new requests from across the business to say, I need a campaign for XYZ. And the marketing department
puts some sources together that defines everything that needs to go into a marketing campaign, and puts some instructions together that defines how to create a marketing campaign, and makes this available to the entire organization so that anybody in the organization can come in here and create a request for a new marketing campaign and have the knowledge that powers that process and the explicit steps that are needed to facilitate that document generation built into the agent's design, published across the organization to save the marketing department significant time and effort in doing this initial pass of fielding these requests. Okay, that's a basic understanding of the fundamental capabilities of a SharePoint agent. So the question becomes, what do we need to know about governing these things? And the answer is, hopefully, only as much as you need to know to govern anything in SharePoint. Because an agent, a SharePoint agent, is ultimately just a file in that site. Okay, when you create a SharePoint agent from a library in a SharePoint site, it is stored as a .agent file in that library that you created it from. Okay, you browse to a library and you choose to create a new agent. What you're going to get is a file, and this file is ultimately just JSON, and that JSON contains the overview, the description, the knowledge sources, the starter prompts, the custom instructions, all of that configuration, all that information that defines that agent is just stored as text in the JSON. And so we save it as a file, and ultimately the question of how we manage access and how we manage permissions is answered by how we manage access and how we manage permissions to any other SharePoint asset. Okay, we rely on the site permissions, we rely on the shareable links. We determine access to the agent by determining who has access to that location, that library, or that site. When you create the agent in the library, it's stored as a file in the library. When you create the agent from the agent's pane in the global navigation bar, it's stored in the site assets library for that site. And so the governance of SharePoint agents can ultimately be answered by asking the question or by understanding how we govern SharePoint as a collaboration platform. Okay, because the agents are just files, and everything that you know about governing any file in SharePoint ultimately applies to governing the SharePoint agents. And that's why when it comes to planning for and defining the governance strategy for SharePoint agents, the conversation ultimately flows from and follows very similarly the conversation of governing SharePoint as a whole. And I've pasted in the chat what I think of as a white paper. It is our implementation guide for Copilot. And it is focused on how to set up your SharePoint content for success with the enablement of generative AI. And in this document, there is a section focused on preparing your SharePoint data estate, relying on the SharePoint controls. And then there is a section on how to prepare your data estate, relying on the purview controls. Okay, so I want to underscore that everything that applies to preparing your data estate for Copilot general availability also applies to governing your data estate for SharePoint agents. And if you follow these steps and guidance in this document, in this white paper, to prepare your data estate, your SharePoint environment for the core Copilot service experience, you're going to be incredibly well positioned to support SharePoint agents as well. Okay, and we want to go through it. All right, so like I said, I could really spin the value of SharePoint agents and talk through that quite a bit more, right? So that's not really the focus of the conversation today, but I did want to at least lay out that groundwork of saying SharePoint agents are only going to offer grounding in SharePoint data. They're always going to enforce SharePoint permissions, and the access to them always inherits from the SharePoint site. And so how we manage SharePoint sites, how we manage SharePoint permissions, and how we manage SharePoint as a service ultimately is the conversation of how we manage SharePoint agents. There are, though, a number of very key administrative tools that really are worth highlighting in this context. And that's what we're going to look at here. And it starts with SharePoint Advanced Management. SharePoint Advanced Management was initially rolled out as a premium feature available to customers to buy into on top of the core service. And Microsoft ultimately decided these tools are so important for enabling and governing AI and governing Copilot that we're going to bake this into the Copilot experience. And any organization that has even one single Copilot license can utilize all of these tools. So SharePoint Advanced Management is available to any Copilot enabled customer. And it doesn't matter how many Copilot licenses you have. You can use the SharePoint Advanced Management services or capabilities to prepare the entire tenant for AI transformation. Okay, and so take a look at this white paper. Look as well at the alternative E3 implementation guide if that's where your licensing sits. If you're in the E5 availability for your workforce, then that's the guide for you. But we have a corresponding guide for the E3 enabled customers as well. And there's a few things here that I think are really worth calling out, okay? Making sure that sites have valid owners via the site ownership policy. This is something that we do at Microsoft under the lifecycle management area, is that we define policies that require that every single site maintain active owners. This is core best practice to all AI, but it's also core best practice to agent governance as well. And it isn't a little bit more for our site owners to maintain in terms of their responsibility of owning a site. Okay, we do need to think about how to ensure that site owners understand SharePoint agents are bringing forward new capabilities into their site, and there is a little bit of an additional responsibility for site owners in reviewing what agents have been built, approving agents for the site, defining the default agent for the site, making sure that agents are being implemented appropriately in the context of their site. This is something that ultimately we are going to rely on our site owners to be responsible for. And so as a service administrator, our key goal is to make sure every site has an owner. That's what we can do with site ownership policies, identify sites that don't meet ownership criteria, send notifications to find new site owners, and mark sites as read-only if we can't find ownership for them. Site attestation policies go hand in hand with this, where we can ensure that each site that does have valid ownership also attests to what is the sensitivity of their site, what is the purpose of their site, and whether or not it's needed for the next renewal of site activity. And then the inactive site policies facilitate the automatic archival and cleanup of stale and retirable collaboration spaces within the organization. So this is definitely one very, very powerful way to ensure that the data estate remains fresh and maintains ownership in terms of the business users that are responsible for their business content. Ensure all sites have a valid owner. Find and clean up inactive sites. The documentation that I've shared with you here walks through quite a bit in that regard and how to enable and implement those particular features. The next thing that SharePoint Advanced Management allows us to do is report on where oversharing is happening at a scale that needs to be addressed. And again, like I said, this conversation feels a lot like the conversation of governing Copilot. And that's because it is. But when it comes to governing SharePoint agents, all of these best practices are also very important. Okay, we're thinking about making sure that every Copilot-enabled user has the ability to leverage SharePoint agents. We want to make sure the data estate is well protected in that context as well. So, oversharing reports. This is where we really start to get into the advanced management capabilities. We come into the advanced management administrative area. We go into the list of all features that we have access to, and we can review the data access governance reports. This is one of the most helpful things that I recommend organizations pursue to ensure that as it relates to oversharing, we have a manageable and tolerable level of risk. It's very challenging to suggest that you are going to guarantee every single document and every single file across the millions of records in SharePoint is permissioned exactly only to the least privileged audience that it should be. That's a reasonable goal, and I'm not dismissing that that is something that we should be pursuing. But to suggest 100% exhaustive efficacy and enforcement towards that goal is a Herculean challenge. Ultimately, we need to find a tolerable level of risk. And when it comes to oversharing, the biggest concern is things that are shared with everyone. Okay, things that are shared in a blanket global scope, accessible to the entire organization, is the first thing we need to tackle. And once we address content that has been shared in that incredibly broad and global scope and mitigate content across the tenant that has that obviously overshared level of permissions, then we can set a threshold that represents our organization's tolerance to oversharing. Okay, and that's by generating a report that tells us every single ACL, every single securable asset in SharePoint, and how many users have access to it. Okay, and you have to decide for your organization what the number of users that have access to a file looks like that represents an oversharing risk. Internally here at Microsoft, that number is 100 users. When more than 100 people have access to a file, it becomes flagged in our oversharing report and triggers processes that initiate a governance review of some kind. And there are plenty of sites that have attestations and labels that allow for that level of broad sharing. Our portal sites, our intranet sites, sites that are divisional or departmental or communication focused are absolutely going to have more than 100 users accessing them. Okay, but that's the level that we set in terms of setting up these reports and generating a remediation plan to say, if you're not in the list of sites that are approved for that level of sharing or that kind of sharing or that communication site type, you can't have that many folks accessing your content without going through some level of labeling of what that content is and some attestation of the purpose of that site. Okay, and that's what these reports allow you to do, is generate an actionable remediation focused spreadsheet that lists out every instance of a SharePoint asset that has over X number of users. And maybe 100 feels a little bit tight for your organization. Maybe it feels a little bit broad for your organization. You can set that number to whatever value is appropriate for your teams and audience when you generate these reports. And that's the next thing that we certainly are advocating for here, is going through the data access governance in the SharePoint Advanced Management tools and ensuring that you have oversharing addressed to the greatest degree possible. The next feature I want to call out, site level access restrictions. Okay, this represents your opportunity to go to a specific set of SharePoint sites or a specific collection of SharePoint sites and say, we can't allow generative AI here. The information in this site is so sensitive that we need to turn off SharePoint agents. And that is an opportunity that you have and are able to utilize when and where that's necessary. Okay, site level access restrictions. First thing you need to do is turn on the tenant level toggle to allow this functionality. Okay, so you turn on site level access restriction, and from there, you can go to any of the sites in your environment. And let's say you have a site that feels like it needs to have generative AI capabilities restricted. And you can open up the SharePoint Administrator portal, go over to the settings, and you can turn on content restriction. And this removes all of the generative AI functionality. Okay, you're not going to be able to leverage Copilot, even in the core Copilot chat experience, to ground against and retrieve information from that particular restricted site. You're also going to be turning off SharePoint agents with this toggle. So if you feel like that's something you need to do, you do have access to a control that allows you to say, for this group of sites, for this collection of sites, we're going to turn off all of our Copilot experiences. And then, hopefully that's not something we have to do exhaustively or at scale, but the mechanism and the control is here if and when we need it. Okay, So again, the implementation guide is walking us through the major considerations around all of this. Control access to overshared SharePoint sites using site access reviews, restricted access control policy, restricted content discoverability. Okay, I'll mention this one as well. Restricted access control policy is a security mechanism that allows for a service administrator, a SharePoint administrator, to apply a security group to a site or sites and ensure that, regardless of any sharing event in that site, access to the site is determined first off by the membership of the security group, so that nobody from within the site could ever share beyond the security group that's defined by the service administrator. This is an opportunity here to ensure that sites that have the most critical business information have a boundary of who is allowed to be given access to them, defined at a service level, and is taken outside of the hands of the site owners and the site members. It's an opportunity there for you to leverage as needed. Going through the remainder of the SharePoint Advanced Management tools, there are a couple of other useful features here. Ultimately, these are, I think, more specific and not necessarily broad best practice controls to explore, okay? But I do encourage you all to go through the full breadth of SharePoint Advanced Management. Most of the functionality here is going to have some relationship to generative AI and Copilot enablement and SharePoint agent governance, okay? So absolutely ensure you've taken the opportunity to review and define your SharePoint Advanced Management controls, to leverage the reports that you have access to as a result of being a Copilot customer. And the last thing I'll mention then, that's not embedded in the SharePoint Advanced Management tool or page, is the Agent Insights report. Okay, because we want SharePoint administrators to have some visibility to the proliferation of and usage around SharePoint agents. And we want SharePoint administrators to be able to report out on what content across the organization SharePoint agents are leveraging. And so these two reports can be incredibly valuable for you as a proactive opportunity to review the proliferation of SharePoint agents across the organization and the body of knowledge across the SharePoint tenant that's being leveraged and invoked and grounded upon by those agents. Okay, so worth exploring, worth making part of your SharePoint administrator's monthly responsibilities here. I don't know that you need to follow this on a daily or weekly basis. Even monthly might be more than is absolutely necessary. We understand this is a very safe and well-guarded sandbox. There's not a lot we can do with these tools that users can't do from the core Copilot service. They're not going to be going out into the areas outside of the M365 service. They're always going to be subject to the permissions of the content that enforce who should or should not have access. And so this is a very safe sandbox. And to be honest, the biggest risk with a SharePoint agent ultimately becomes supportability, okay? Because as I'm communicating here, the risk around data isn't going to be different than the risk that you have with just your core Copilot or even just your core search or your core collaboration, right? If your data is not secure, Copilot is one part of the story of the risk, but it's not the only part. And the core collaboration experiences across Teams and Outlook and SharePoint and OneDrive are all going to inherit risk if your data estate is not well secured, right? So that's not really a Copilot issue. That's a pure collaboration experience issue. The risk for SharePoint agents is mostly around supportability when users create something that is so impactful that it ultimately grows to a level that requires enterprise support. And this is certainly a possible reality. Okay, users are going to be out here creating SharePoint agents, and those agents might actually become transformative to the business. And they might be so impactful that they actually need a support plan, right? We need our SharePoint, like somebody builds a SharePoint agent and it starts to drive a business critical process. And now we need a multi-owner strategy for that agent. And we need a plan if the agent owner leaves the organization or changes roles or is not able to maintain it further, and we need an opportunity to potentially say this agent is so important that we're not even going to let folks develop it anymore in production, right? Which we understand every SharePoint agent is in production. And so if an agent becomes so impactful that it now creates a risk if somebody makes a breaking change to that agent's configuration and undermines a business process that's become dependent upon it, we're going to start to hear about that. This is probably the biggest risk for SharePoint agents, right? Because ultimately it's likely to happen, and there needs to be some visibility of what agents are out there and how broad and how significant their usage is. And reviewing these reports on a monthly basis to say, okay, here's a SharePoint agent that has over 1,000 users. We might need to think about potentially moving this into zone 2. And we're going to talk about zone 2 and zone 3 next week. And we're going to understand how we move agents from zone 1 into zone 2 when they cross that threshold of impact to the business and criticality that requires additional support. And that is probably where I would say the biggest essential, the biggest responsibility and the biggest need for business, for IT processes that ensure that we're staying on top of the agents that are growing in that regard resides, is ensuring that when things approach a level of business impact that starts to consider they need to be a zone 2 or a zone 3 managed solution, we have some process that allows us to proactively monitor for that kind of situation so that we're not always dealing with a reactive model where something has become impactful and we don't know about it until the owner retires, and now we're left with a business process that is not functioning correctly because the agent that has become ingrained into that process has lost its ability to be maintained by the business users that built it. Okay, we're getting close on time. Hopefully this is a very helpful starting point. We intended to cover Copilot Studio Lite and Agent Builder today as well, but I got a little bit caught up in the conversation. Hopefully it still felt like a valuable use of time. I think we'll plan to repurpose the time that we have next week a little bit to include the Agent Builder perspective. I want to pause here and check in with Jay and see whether there's any conversations that have come up in the chat that would be helpful to address as part of the presentation. I appreciate there has been some good discussion going on in the chat. I haven't been able to fully lock in and support that directly. But Jay, let me know if there's anything that you feel like we should address as far as questions that came up and best practices around the information we presented that are worth addressing as we close out today's session.
Yeah, definitely, Nick. And great session there. It was fantastic, my friend. A couple of questions did come up. I think a lot of people have a good handle on the risk of SharePoint, how to protect SharePoint and using SAM for those types of things. Some people are asking questions around licensing. So what about the risk of people using it who don't have a Copilot license when it comes to pay-as-you-go?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, ultimately, the risk in that regard exists only if the organization enables the pay-as-you-go services, right? So in terms of the default configuration of an M365 tenant that has Copilot, if a user does not have a Copilot license, they can't access SharePoint agents, period, right? And so there's no risk to, absorb cost or to have unintended expenses unless you have enabled billing policies that allow access to pay-as-you-go usage of SharePoint agents. Now, if you have enabled these kinds of billing policies, then there is a fairly nuanced conversation that needs to be explored, right? Which is ultimately the billing policies that allow for the enablement of pay-as-you-go services within SharePoint agents are not intended to support individual use cases, okay? If you want to enable pay-as-you-go access to SharePoint agents, the purpose of this mechanism is to allow this broadly and to basically say, I have a group of users that I want to allow to access to SharePoint agents, and I don't need to govern which agents they have pay-as-you-go access to. I just need to give them access to this feature in SharePoint without paying for a full Copilot license. Okay, this is how we provide broad access to the feature of SharePoint agents to an intended group of users, but we don't have control on a per agent basis with this mechanism. Now, that's not to say you can't provision a SharePoint agent that is a pay-as-you-go experience, but you can't do it as a SharePoint agent in terms of where it's built, okay? If you need to provision a single agent as a SharePoint agent that still allows for pay-as-you-go access to a subset of users, you have to build the agent in Zone 2 in Copilot Studio. And that's actually what you see here, okay, is that this marketing department has, this is not a fully realized demo. I deployed a completely random agent into a completely random site, but hopefully the concept is still useful to say this is a Copilot Studio Zone 2 agent. It has a Copilot Studio Power Platform billing policy applied to the environment it was built from that allows for pay-as-you-go access only to this one agent, and it's published to SharePoint so that the users that I've permissioned to that environment, that have been permissioned to access this agent, can now leverage pay-as-you-go as the licensing or entitlement mechanism to interact with this agent. I had to do this through Copilot Studio, through Zone 2, through a billing policy in the Power Platform admin portal. Permissions and access are entirely governed through that Power Platform experience in Copilot Studio Full. But the end result is a SharePoint agent accessible to unlicensed users that allows for pay-as-you-go to give them access to this one solution. Hopefully that at least answers the question at a high level, which is to say, if you want to use the billing policies in the M365 admin portal, we have to understand the intent behind these is broad access to the core features. If you want to empower a single agent to allow pay-as-you-go access to a SharePoint agent experience, you have to go through that Zone 2 Copilot Studio approach.
Awesome, Nick. And I guess a follow-up question for that one too. What if it's an agent that somebody creates the Copilot license and they share it out with somebody else who doesn't have a license and they do have pay-as-you-go billing set up? Does it then use that pay, or can you restrict basically the pay-as-you-go to not use those SharePoint agents?
So if you turn on the tenant level M365 admin portal pay-as-you-go features, it's a user scoped policy. Anybody that's in the group of users that has access to this billing policy can participate through pay-as-you-go to any agents that are shared with them as SharePoint agents.
Gotcha. But they'd have to be in this group then.
Exactly.
Okay, so there's the control for that particular one. Great one there. One other question, if you have time, can we restrict users to use a SharePoint agent but not create agents in SharePoint? Not sure if that makes sense.
This goes back to the point that everything relating to SharePoint agents inherits from SharePoint permissions.
Right.
If you have permissions in a site to create files, you can create agents. But if you don't, but there's certainly read-only access to SharePoint sites. Okay. Right. And so if you are a read-only user, if you are in the site's visitors group, this means you are a visitor to the site. You can access the agents in that site if you have read-only access, visitor access to the data those agents are grounded in. And as long as you don't have access to create files in the site, you can't create agents either. So ultimately, the answer to the question is yes. Yes. By making a user a visitor and also ensuring they're Copilot enabled, they will have access to use any SharePoint agents that are deployed in that site. And they won't be able to create agents because they don't have the ability to create anything in the site, right? And the permissions inherit entirely from what can the user do in the site. That's the answer to the question of what can the user do as it relates to agents in the site. Perfect.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. I think that's all of our questions for today. And as always, people, if you do have questions come up, drop myself an email. We can get those answered as well for something we didn't cover today. I will be sending out the recording of this particular meeting for everybody to consume later this afternoon. And I will also be sharing out this particular deck, and I will make a little modification. One person said kind of, what are the 3 fundamental steps? So I'll make a little modification to the deck to kind of pull that out for us too. But thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for a great session. Awesome session. Thank you again. Thank you for all that attended today. We had a lot of people come in. A lot of people came in, came out, came in, back in, came out, and came back in. So that was great. Fantastic. So thank you, Nick. Thank you, everybody else on the call. And join us next week. Another fantastic session next week by Nick. So please be there. If you haven't registered, I dropped that link in the chat before. But please come and join us next Friday for our follow-up session on agent governance. Everybody have a great rest of the day, great rest of the week. And Nick, thank you so much, my friend.
Yep. Cheers, all. Take care. See you next week.